The Mexican state evolved in many ways the same way that we did. So it's very similar to our own colonial era experiences in a lot of ways. So around 9,000 years ago, there's evidence that the ancient indigenous peoples had domesticated corn. They'd initiated really an agricultural revolution, leading to the formation of many complex civilizations. By the time the Europeans got there in the 16th century, you had competing kingdoms that had been dominated and united. So again, go back to the theory of state evolution. We have dominance and the union of these various kingdoms under the Triple Alliance of I'm sorry, I can't pronounce this, but I'm going to say Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlaco, that form the nucleus of the Aztec Empire. So what you need to remember is this is the period of the Aztec Empire, which was an alliance of three, but not everyone was in the alliance. And so Cortez came in 1519, and within 3 years he defeated the Aztecs, in part by allying with other local opposition groups, like the Confederacy of the Tlaxcala. That's how I pronounce them. There's probably a better pronunciation out there. So in part they allied with local opposition, but in part they decimated the population the sort of natural way that we saw in the United States as well, bringing disease. And so smallpox killed between somewhere, look at the numbers we're talking about in the 16th century, but somewhere between 10 and 50% of the population. And within a century, the population plummeted from about 25 million or so to about 1 million. The survivors became largely an underclass. They became landless peasants. Many of them became slaves. And under Spanish rule, we're talking about a society that was hierarchical, largely authoritarian, militaristic in terms of the leadership, and very corrupt. So when people complain about corruption in Mexico today, well, hey, we can look back a little bit further. So some highlights from history. By the 19th century, there was a split between aristocrats who were loyal to Spain and wealthy, powerful local class known as the criollos. These were later generations, subsequent European generations, I guess I should stress, that were born in Mexico, increasingly, though, with mixed ancestry. And this led to the Mexican War of Independence, which went from 1810 to 1821. Spain's weakness during this period, remember, this is the period when Napoleon was going east and west, and so when they went west, they never eat shredded wheat. Yeah, when they went west, they ran into Spain. So Spain was weakened by Napoleon, and this led in 1812 to demands for a liberal constitution, demands for change. And again, we're not talking about Spain here, but this should ring some bells. So there were the demands were echoed. The king tried to resist these. He tried to use the military to consolidate his power. In Mexico, again, we're talking about a lot of the same things playing out. And so you had a mostly isolated guerrilla pro-independence group, or a set of groups really, that were on the verge of defeat, fighting against these aristocrats who were loyal to Spain, which was facing its own set of problems. And then two things happened which changed the dynamics of the conflict. First, in 1820, Spanish soldiers that were bound for Mexico staged a mutiny. And the mutiny they staged wasn't for political reasons. It was over poor conditions in Spain. And then this, of course, brought up a list of political motives. So the central motive, again, was this economic reality. And then these economic grievances led to political demands, and they forced the king to sign on to a constitution. So this should ring some bells. And then the second element here was that Mexican elites who were on the verge of victory, so these aristocrats who were loyal to Spain, disliked this new constitution that the Spanish king had signed on to. They preferred the status quo. And so in 1821, they created an independent Mexico rather than allow the criollos who were fighting them to benefit from the changes. In this 11-year war of independence, about 600,000 people were killed. So it was a very devastating war, especially if you relate it to our own Civil War. So now we move into a newly independent Mexico. After the war, the conservatives ruled. Remember, the conservatives were the ones who essentially had the upper hand in the war in the first place. They declared independence. And so this was a period when we're talking about large amounts of poverty, political instability, the dominance really of local military strongmen. These were the ones who were actually running the state. National strongmen couldn't impose their authority in many places. So, for example, Texas seceded in 1836. The next violent period you have is the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, when Mexico actually loses about half of its territory, the Southwest. And this prompts the Mayan uprising, also known as the War of Castes. These people objected to the political and economic supremacy of the Europeans. So again, war was a catalyst for other dynamic changes that were going on in the country. Liberals eventually come to power, and they seek to centralize and modernize the state and reduce the influence of the church over the state. So the church had a very influential role up until 1857. And in 1857, Juarez passes a new constitution, which calls for a relatively weak presidency and a strong unicameral legislature. This is the Congress of the Union, as well as an 11-member Supreme Court. What else? In the Constitution, slavery is abolished. And again, importantly, the church is limited. And this prompts the Mexican Reform War, which pits liberal federalists against the conservative pro-church and pro-military types, people who want a stronger role of the church and the military in the state. So skipping ahead, eventually what you've got is the consolidation, this increased authoritarian rule, especially, so beginning in the 1860s, but especially by 1870, when we can really talk about authoritarian rule. From 1880 to 1910, the state was run by General Porfirio Diaz. This was brutal, but it was also a period of economic development. And again, if you look back over the cases, what you find is that often political brutality or political illiberalism coincides with economic development. In other words, these people aren't just abusing their own population for fun, they're actually doing it in the name of economic development or economic change. Doesn't mean that everyone benefits, doesn't mean that it's normatively the right thing to do. It just means that there are trade-offs that are being engaged in by these leaders, and that they're not just bloodthirsty tyrants. Now remember that economic development tends to privilege the leading class, so of course they're not being altruistic either. From 1910 to 1920, you have this revolution by the middle class, and so there's political turmoil. There's a struggle between democratic reformers, populists, radical social reformers, and this struggle results in demographic changes as many flee the north, and up to 1.5 million people end up dead through various causes. So this is another profound moment, and so who comes to power? Well, look, this is when you've got the rise of the PRI. So Mexican politics remained largely dominated by military leaders up until the 1940s, but beginning in the late 19-teens, 1920s, we can talk about the rise of a single-party state. And this was formalized in 1929. But let's go back a second. So generals in the 1920s ultimately created this party, the PRI, they were involved in overt military influence that went up until the 1940s, when you had a power struggle within the PRI, and then the PRI becomes a single party. PRI leads over a single party state without direct military influence. But stepping back, President Obregon was elected in 1920, and he rules until 1924. And what he does is he promotes land reform. He allows for trade unions, which were brought under the state, and this becomes very characteristic of PRI rule, where we'll talk about the corporatist setup in a couple minutes. So this is important. He allows for the construction of trade unions and brings them under the state. From 1924 to 1928, President Calles is in charge, and here we've got the first income tax, so the expansion of the state, the beginning of these investments in education and infrastructure. But you also have a crackdown on the church, which supported the Diaz dictatorship from before. So finally, Calles helps to create the PRI in 1929, and this is the party of the state. What they are trying to do is seek an end to political violence by controlling really the state and society as well. So the PRI regime involves a strong president who's directly elected. PRI presidents would name their successor candidates, sort of like what you saw in Russia in the last decade. The PRI machinery, the party machinery, has been used to dispense patronage, and they control pretty much every branch of the government. So Mexico appeared relatively democratic under PRI rule from the 1920s up until the early 1990s. They had generally free elections. They had opposition parties that contested these. They had a generally free media. But it was really a much better example of competitive authoritarianism than democracy. It was not a liberal democracy. The PRI dominated the major social organizations. For example, labor, peasant organizations. They co-opted other parties. So they brought these parties into their fold. They co-opted the media through various mechanisms, and which we'll talk about when we talk about civil society. And they also used electoral fraud, although this was a last resort, classic for competitive authoritarian regime. So was it a democracy? No, it wasn't a democracy. But was it a strong-armed authoritarian state? Well, not necessarily either. So this was authoritarianism with civil liberties. Abuses were really kept to a minimum. Things begin to change for the PRI in the 1980s when you have an economic crisis. And again, this should ring some bells. Economic crisis leading to political change. The conservative opposition in the North demanded free market reforms, and they seriously contested local and state elections, which made it necessary for the PRI to engage in more fraud. Finally, in 2000, Vicente Fox from the Partido Acción Nacional, PAN, wins the day, and you finally have reformers who come into power. And this lasts. The reformists are essentially in power up until just recently, 2012, when you have the PRI coming back in. So we're going to leave off here with this evolution, and we'll talk about the constitutional arrangements in the next slide.